Hello and welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. I'm Tony.
I'm Patrick.
And we are working our way through Craig Keener's book on miracles. Actually, it's a 2-volume set, as you probably know by now if you've been following us. And we're looking at the first volume, a particular section in the first volume where he deals with Hume and the various miracle arguments that Hume makes, actually arguments against miracles that Hume makes here. And so we have reached real close to the end of these particular chapters that he deals with Hume. He's going to move on later into the book and talk about various contemporary miracles and how to look at those things. But we want to finish up this section on our good friend David Hume. And chapter 6 is developing Hume's skepticism toward miracles. One of the, issues here is how have scientists and historians considered looking at these particular issues? And he suggested last time in our video that, there's been some biases, even though they have claimed to try to avoid those biases, especially with regard to comparing religious miracles with other religions. And Hume makes a big deal out of this particular issue. In fact, Hume suggests that this is a reason not to believe miracles because different miracle claims from different religions, Hume suggests, contradict each other, and so they rule out each other, right? So that's the claim here. Now, if you're thinking ahead of us here, you might see some serious problems with that, and he's beginning here to point these out. So here's the claim: incompatible religions with regard to claims of miracles. Hume himself may illustrate, he tells us, this disposition that he's been talking about to neutralize religious particularities when he offers the above noted complaint that incompatible religions all claim miracles. And of course, if that's the case, then they rule each other out, right? And so he says that Hume probably drew this argument from the deists, who in turn had used similar arguments of Protestant and Catholics polemicizing against each other's miracles, right? The Protestants would say this, the Catholics would say this. Well, nobody's right, and it rules out miracles altogether.
This is the Godzilla against the other monsters of let them fight. And yes. So he just stands back.
He says, but using this observed incompatibility as an objection to miracles fails, he tells us, to reckon with multiple potential philosophic alternatives to the objection. And so now he's going to dive directly into dealing with Hume's objection, this incompatibility objection, in the rest of this chapter.
Right, which are really the deist ideas that Hume is taking and writing about them. Well, for example, such miracles could be understood as supreme powers' goodwill towards people of different faiths without necessarily endorsing particular beliefs. And again, just draw biblical parallels here. You have the Ark of the Covenant going around to different people and different people groups and operating outside the norm prescribed. Some people are cursed and some people are blessed for it. And it depends on, what the sovereign power is wanting to show here. And now we know the CIA has it. So if that's not a condemnation against the United States government, I don't know what is. But
yeah, and another illustration is Moses when he was, trying to, get the people out of Egypt. And we saw some of the Egyptian magicians were able to duplicate at least a few of the miracles that he had, right?
Yeah, exactly. So again, we're dealing with worldviews, and to just neutralize them out is not being neutral.
Right.
Well, the related idea that most miracles in response to prayers do not explicitly specify a particular religious system. The systems could be less incompatible than their adherents suppose. Or one could argue that there are multiple supernatural, or at least superhuman powers, a view held by traditional religions, and even by most traditional forms of monotheism. So there's a whole slew of them. So, when we talk about wanting to study prayer, right, it's almost like this input A, get output B thing. But when we're talking about what, at least monotheistic, especially Christians, people believe about prayer, we're not dealing with a computer. We're dealing with an entity that has wants and wills and desires as well. And so, when we study prayer and we go, well, prayer is not effective here. Well, yes, that is sometimes what we can expect. Just like how, going to your parents every time right before 5 o'clock and asking for a cookie sometimes gets you a yes, but not always. And most of the time it gets you a no. So we can assume that there are no parents anywhere because they've said no so many times.
And nothing happened. Right.
Exactly.
The button and nothing happened. I guess, there's no parents. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
I pushed the cookie button.
So would we have to understand the idea of what actually is being talked about rather than, this kind of naturalistic system that we're wanting to compare it to? We need to realize that there's a whole slew of different responses that can come about for this, and just throwing up our hands and saying, well, there's no good explanation is lazy. And honestly, we all know the reason for it. It's because we don't want to deal with it, or we want to scoff at it. So that's the true form there.
And so he tells us one need not subscribe to any of the particular one or a combination of these responses to acknowledge that Hume's objection is massively vulnerable to logical criticism that he failed to anticipate, right? In fact, already in his contemporaries challenged some of his premises on this particular matter. For example, he tells us some of his early evidentialist critics insisted on inductive examination of miracle claims in question. So we don't just rule out all miracles. Let's look at them, right?
Yeah, right.
Arguing that the compelling claims for miracles, that is, in other religions, were historically weaker, for instance, than those in the New Testament. So let's look at them and consider, let's not throw them all out because, they're competing with each other. So nobody's right.
Right. No, let's lump them all together. And then therefore it stamps out everything. Just like how we take everybody's witnesses accounts to all high crimes that come in. And we just conclude that there must not be a body here for us to evaluate. So we know that a murder didn't happen because there are so many competing claims out there. Right. That's not what we do for that either. We evaluate. We take into account. We look at multiple other factors. We have a system set up, and we might have different true eyewitness accounts, and so we need to kind of make a way for that explanatory power to come in. Well, moreover, Hume's complaint ignores some concrete data. Not least, he failed to give attention to concrete facts that not all religions equally claim miracles, right? Not all of them do. A lot of the Islamic ideas don't really have miracles per se that things like the Old Testament and the New Testament do. Now, they hitch on the wagon, as Christians hitch on to the Old Testament as well. And so if we cancel those out, then we're left with the New Testament. And with what we have in the Quran and the Hadiths, we don't really see the type of miracle claims there. So here we can't just say, well, there's Muslims, there's Christians, there's Jewish people, and so they all cancel each other out. That's not what's happening. We need to take a look at each miracle in and of themselves and see if they have validity. Well, further, not all miracle claims are equally well attested. For example, those in historical narrative recounting recent events are not comparable in historical value to legends transmitted orally for centuries or surfacing first in generally non-factual genres. It is a logical fallacy to reject stronger claims simply because weaker ones exist. On such grounds, one could dispute most kinds of truth claims since they usually have false or weaker competitors. So, you have Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. If he thanks Apollo and Zeus for letting it happen, well, we know that didn't happen because he's attributing the claims to gods. We know that they don't exist, and so Caesar never crossed the Rubicon. Right? He was disproportionately disadvantaged. He won against Pompey, and we know that couldn't happen because that's just so outside the realm. And he's invoking a deity that he's saying helped him in this endeavor. So we know that didn't happen. No, that's not what we do. We don't do that for things that we kind of all accept in history. So let's not do it for claims that happen in history that we just don't want to deal with because we want to be neutral, or what we really want to do is reject it all.
And he says, most important, Hume's counting the testimonies of different religions against one another indeed is poor logic in any case, right? No court, he tells us, would throw out two testimonies on the alleged allegation that, well, one of them is false, so we have to throw one out,
Exactly.
Both of them out, right? One is false, so let's throw both of them out. He says some could be true, right? Some claims could be true, miracle claims, and others false. But the recognition that some miracle claims may be, and in fact are false, does nothing to damage the possibility that some other miracle claims may prove true, right? It's kind of like, let's say that I use this illustration with the students that I teach often. Let's say that we're waiting outside the classroom because the door is locked and I don't have a key to it. We can't see in. And we get into discussion about how many chairs are in the classroom, right? And somebody says, I think there are 30 chairs. And somebody else says, no, there are 35. And somebody says, no, every class has 40 chairs. And somebody else says, well, this one I think has 42. And somebody walks by hearing our discussion say, wow, they all disagree on how many chairs there are in the classroom. I guess there's no real number of chairs in the classroom. Well, of course we wouldn't say that, right?
Right.
And so, that's the point I think that he's trying to make here. Some could be true, others false, but we don't throw out all of them because of the disagreement, right? That's the issue. And so he goes on to say that his goal here is not to favor a specific possible response to Hume or a combination of response over the others in this matter, but to point out that once potential alternatives are factored in, Hume's argument from compelling religions, he says, is too fragile to bear any weight. It's just not a good argument, Hume. Sorry. Right? We don't throw them all out just because they may disagree with each other.
Right. Exactly. We can attribute the negative effects of killing a peacock to Hera, right? And say, well, I've had just this rough life because I ran over this peacock, and you can take that in the same one as there's a pastor, Dwayne Miller, who he had a voice issue. And he's sitting there and he's preaching, and during his preaching on the sovereignty of God, all of a sudden his voice cracks and then gets better all of a sudden. And it's on audio tape. And he attributes it to a miracle. Combining those two together, it does a disservice to both of them, right? So not taking a look at one and not taking a look at the other and just lumping them together to dismiss them does a disservice to that inductive approach that at least Hume is claiming to try and make. Instead, we kind of looked at that's not the case of what he's doing. But so taking those two cases in equal fashion does a disservice to both of them.
By the way, he's already argued we can't talk induction anyway. But anyway, we won't go there. We won't go there.
Exactly. All right. Well, what about disbelief in miracles as a dogmatic assumption? Is that possible, or only religious people able to hold dogmatic assumptions? Well, we'll see here. Well, all these points aside, we must also examine the question of alternative explanations for supernatural claims. As a crazy wacko Christian, I also hold to this as well. We should look at alternative explanations for supernatural claims, as extra normal phenomena need not be construed as divinely or even supernaturally caused simply because those who experience it so interpret it. Scholars working from a variety of all religious and philosophical assumptions may recognize the validity of claims about events, say spontaneous remission of a disease, without necessarily accepting the claimant's interpretation of events, say of divine healing. So again, the example I brought up of the pastor with the voice issue. It seems very interesting that it's happening during the sermon. It's happening at almost the peak of the sermon on God's sovereignty, and then it happens there. But, maybe by some evolutionary factor, it all of a sudden is spontaneously brought into this type of remission. But the interpretation and the actual events do operate on two different levels as well. Yeah. Well, some events offer more compelling evidence for supernatural activity than others, but where one places the bar depends in great measure on one's initial assumptions. It's almost like a recurring factor here.
And so it tells us that views about whether any intelligence exists outside of nature are interpretations, right? Not data. Right. Hence, belonging to a different sphere of reasoning than purely empirical scientific expert converge. Right. So here, whether or not an intelligence exists outside of nature is an interpretation of the things that we observe. Those are not the things that we observe. He says, put more simply, everyone has presupposition. No duh, right? Everyone has presuppositions. Those who dismiss others' evidence because those offering it have differing presuppositions are being neither charitable nor open-minded, and they short-circuit the possibility of dialogue. So if I just dismiss somebody because they don't align with my presupposition, well, I don't get a chance to talk and maybe improve or consider their particular issue from their perspective and my own. He says, for instance, if an eyewitness claims that she has witnessed someone raised from the dead, one is free to explore multiple explanations for such claims, but simply to assume, barring other plausible naturalistic explanations, that such claims must be disingenuous, in each case exalts one's presuppositions over the evidence. And of course, that's not scientific, right? We want to look at the evidence.
Right. Right. This is starting to become a common trope, even among, the debate bros, is, if you were shown on the surface of the moon, it spelled out your name, this is God of the Bible, believe in me. Well, what would you assume? Well, it's probably some hallucination. It's probably some trick. Aliens. It could be all sorts of aliens. The one thing that I know is not the case is that it's not the biblical Christian God, because I don't believe in him and I also hate him. So I'm being facetious there, but sometimes shoe and the mirror fits.
An element of truth in a lot of this.
Exactly. All right. Well, what about this shift in the Western worldview? Well, the Western worldview has been shifting towards a more open posture towards other worldviews. Although we need not uncritically embrace all worldview shifts as beneficial. Hopefully, we've gotten that by now, but I think we'll probably need to learn a little bit more about that in the future. We often cannot accommodate new knowledge without being willing to consider stretching or replacing traditional paradigms.
Yeah, right. This is something that Thomas Hume, philosopher of science, right, dealt with. That sometimes we're stuck in a particular paradigm we can't get out, right? And so it has to be replaced with another one. And oftentimes the old fogies who are stuck in it never get out of it. And it's the younger people that have to replace it and move on from it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But sometimes it's those old fogies that instill in it their predecessor, their successor. And that successor comes back and says, hey, you were right the whole time. And that upends the whole thing. And I don't appreciate that.
So, all right. So this shift among scholars, and he says resistance or not, a shift in worldview has been occurring, he tells us, right? So notice now he's going to talk more about this view with regard to miracles. And he's suggesting here that there's been a shift, right? In Hume's day, it was, let's condemn them. They don't exist.
Let's throw them in insane asylums.
Let's define them away, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
He says, so, a shift in worldview has been occurring, and Boltzmann's once already assumption that no one in the modern world believes in miracles is even more demonstrably false today than when he claimed it, right? He says, obviously no one in the modern world believes in miracles. That's what he claimed, right? He said, so Keener tells us that likewise that he noted in the last chapter and in this one, the particular arguments once used by, for instance, Spinoza, Hume, and others to form the modern consensus against miracles made sense only on the philosophic and scientific presuppositions of their era, right? Not those of our era. So, and that's what he's going to pursue here in this particular section.
Right. One of the worst things that ever happened to atheism is ideas of the Big Bang, because you don't have a solid state universe. It wasn't existing and always existing. There was a start. Oh man, if there was a start, maybe there was a starter to it, and then you have to divide by your negative I and get a round perspective. But then when you put in the real numbers, well, then it gets to a point. Oh man, we're back to a point again. We understand things about, well, we'll just throw in the multiverse, and we don't have any evidence to that, but it just really helps us out with our math to make this the only world where evolution, the numbers work, because if we posit infinity worlds, then this is at least the one that did work.
At least get to one, yeah.
Good, we're there.
Yeah. What's the evidence? Well, do we observe them? No, yeah. But they have to be there for our assumptions.
This is me grabbing at my straws. I'm getting there. Just give me enough of them. Well, more scholars today acknowledge that the long-standing academic assumptions that only atheistic or deistic approaches can be objective, i.e. epistemologically neutral, presupposes that atheism or deism is self-evidently true. It does not prove their truth, and it's certainly not neutral. New Testament scholars have become increasingly less comfortable with such unproven postulates of the Enlightenment era. And that's very true. You have both scientists, you have both from looking at biology to even computer science, you have philosophers, you have New Testament scholars, which you would think almost would represent the crazy Christian fundamentalists. They weren't always the case, but now we're starting to be a little bit more crazy and Christian and fundamentalist again. So, let's make Christianity Christian again.
And he gives us, by the way, an example of a historical Jesus scholar, Marcus Borg, who rightly points out, he tells us, the primary intellectual objection to supernatural activity flows from a rigid application of the modern worldview's definition of reality. Yet the modern view is not one of a large number of the modern view is but one of a large number of humanity's constructed maps of reality. It is historically the most recent, obviously,
right.
And it's impressive because of the degree of control that it gives us, but is no more an absolute map of reality than any of the previous maps. All, he says, are relative, products of particular histories and culture, and the modern one, like its predecessors, notice, will be superseded, because that's always happened in every era, right? And so, yes, we have a good one. Yes, it seems to work, but so did other folks in other historical epochs, and ours will be superseded, he's arguing, just like the rest of them. So we can't say we have finally arrived in the way we view things is the be all and end all, right?
Exactly. It happened with science. It happened with philosophy. It happened with morality. So let's just assume we're all wrong. Except, what seems weird is once you apply Christian principles to life in ways that the Christian worldview operates, it seems like you have things like the perpetuation of children to supplant their parents at an increasing rate. You have a more moral system. You have a more giving system. You're less likely to have things like slavery and various other societal ills. And, it's not always perfect, but it does seem pretty interesting that the one thing to come 2,000 years ago that said, if you apply this type of system with this belief structure, you actually get positive benefits from it that correspond to flourishing in reality. That seems to kind of be happening, and it's only now that we're almost forced to recognize ourselves as having that truth as well. So, but let the modern worldview turn us under, and let's embrace the cross.
And every view of reality in every historical era thought their view was correct, right? I mean, on pain of illogic, if you're living 2,000 years ago, the Earth had to be the center of our solar system. I mean, just look up in the sky. The sun is going
99% of scientists believe it. 99% of them.
So it has to be the case. What are you, you'd have to be crazy not to believe that.
Right.
Well, guess what? We don't believe that.
for a modern audience, yes.
And so it was superseded by a different view. Now, again, we're not saying that there were things that were not right in that view, and we're not saying that there are things that are not right in our modern view. The point he's trying to make is, we don't make our view it, period, and assume all of our presuppositions have to be correct because we're in the modern view. Right. Use the modern view.
Exactly. All right. Well, do modern people believe in miracles? Are the populace themselves, are they so corrupt as to believe magic sky daddies, to raining answers to prayers down from the sky and turning water to wine yet again? Well, in considering the shift in the Western worldview, we should not take into account only those who are experts in narrowly defined fields of knowledge. It's good, it's understandable from an academic standpoint, but that's not how most people operate. Not all of them are equally relevant to the matter at hand. Consensus does not determine truth, and many statements of consensus are premature in any case. And let me just point to you to the last 5 years in the filming of this episode, at least the last 5 years. I go back further, but I don't think we have the memory for that. So that's the case.
Right. And so the question he's pursuing here is, the claim is, well, the modern worldview doesn't believe in miracles. That's what Hume Company and further got. Well, okay, let's look at what modern people, that would be folks like us, right? Or people that live in our time. Let's take a look at what they believe. Do they not believe in miracles? And so this is what he finds. He says the observation that belief in miracles persists, indeed flourishes in the modern world, is even more obvious today than it could have been in Boltzmann's era when he said the modern people don't believe in miracles, right? John Mayer points out that a 1989 Gallup poll showed that 82% of the people in the United States believed in miracles today, with only 6% categorically rejecting that view. All right. And then he says a more recent Pew Forum survey concludes that 79% affirm that miracles still occur today as in ancient time. Today, by the way, this is modern, right? More surprisingly, he tells us 34% of Americans claim to have witnessed or experienced divine healing. And so what is he getting at here? Well, he says one might disagree with all of these claims, but one could not simply arbitrarily exclude all the claimants from the modern worldview. They're living in the modern worldview, and yet they're holding to miracles. So you can't say that in the modern worldview, nobody believes in miracles. That's just false on the face of it.
So the scientists just haven't done their job of getting it into the masses. So just do better. Just do better. Well, by defining modernity ethnocentrically in terms of mid-20th century academic Western elite, Boltzmann was simply restating his own philosophic presuppositions, many of which, such as those reflecting the influence of Heidegger, are no longer fashionable in the academy. Oh, so it was like he was right at the time, but now it's faux pas, and you should throw out his ideas because he was wrong. Indeed, no less scholar than Karl Barth criticized Boltzmann, and again, if you're agreeing with Barth, be on a hesitant side, but he criticized Barth for uncritically rejecting some 19th century miracle accounts. As another scholar complains, Boltzmann and others excluded miracles without considering any of the strong concrete evidence for miracles. Yet, if the hallmark of empirical science is impartial openness to evidence, such a way of proceeding can hardly be called scientific. So if you just say it doesn't accord to my worldview, I know miracles don't happen because they're a violation of nature or whatever bad definition you want to give it. I won't look at it. No, thank you. You're crazy. Off the chart. You're not doing science. You're doing politics.
Right. Or worse, right? Right. If there's anything. Anyway, we won't go there. All right. So how does he conclude this particular chapter? Well, he says that the traditional radical Enlightenment prejudice against miracles rested on philosophic premises regarding nature, he says, that have since broken down, right? We don't hold those anymore, he says. Prejudice against the testimony of people with religious interests likewise reflected, notice, a specific Enlightenment milieu and need not be maintained today. So it was just a particular view in a particular era of the past. He says a merely intuitive rejection of supernatural claims thus rests not so much on an argument intelligible in our own cultural settings, but on an older academic tradition that was full of various presuppositions, right? And in a flexible prejudice against the possibility then of supernatural activities is no more neutral than a priori commitment to that possibility is, right? So either one, is not neutral, right? And so we need to be careful when we say, well, I'm being neutral and, Hume, and therefore I'm not going to examine miracle claims. In fact, I'm going to say that the very fact that two competing religions have different ones means that we can throw them all out, right, which is kind of ridiculous, right?
And this idea of, well, just show me the evidence. It needs to happen, right? It needs to happen, but the flippant way that it does occur, it gets in the way, and we all understand what's going on, and we do need to bring forth the case, and to dismiss something as being written down or happening, 2 years before the photocopier or the home video camera or the cell phone would go the opposite way, right? So the pictures of flying saucers. Well, everything can be fake now. So now that we have better cameras, we know that everything's fake because if we see flying saucers, then they're fake. So, when is evidence acceptable? It has to be taken in through one's worldview, and we need to be honest about that. And it doesn't seem like Hume did the best service in the world for anybody. He obtained power. People got power for a while, and then, like all scientific revolutions, you fall out of power, and we need to understand that as well. All right. Well, that's the book for what we're going to cover. Hopefully you did pick it up and find it valuable. Again, Keener goes through a whole litany of different miracle claims in his book. It'll be interesting. I do plan to continue going from the start and reading forward to see what else I missed. But I think this was a really well-written book. Hopefully this one tends to be the portions that we covered was a bit more on the academic side for the a priori's and terminology there. So hopefully this helped you along. And once you get to this point in the book, you can just listen to our episodes again and go through it. And so we'll read along with you yet again. All right. Well, next time I'll usually do our preview for the book. We're going to kind of continue a little bit in a similar nature. I think we know which way we're going to turn for the next book. And that one we'll do the entirety of the book. So we'll let you know what it is, give us time to catch up to it, and then us in the past, your future or present is reading the book, but we haven't yet. So you got to give us time. So the magic of the internet there.
No, it's us in a different world.
Right. I know it didn't happen because out of all the possible worlds, it didn't happen in this one. So it happened in a different one. Right. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time.